The first time I saw the Browning version, the Anthony Asquith version, was, I think, about 10 years ago. I was in Los Angeles. I was invited to a dinner, and I was dressing for dinner, which is sort of appropriate for the film because it's a great scene in the Browning version when the same thing happens. And I had the TV on, and I was channel hopping, and I found this film, and I didn't recognize the film. Clearly, it was an old film. It was black and white. Clearly, it was a British film, and there was something about it that immediately caught my attention, which was to do with the style of acting and this kind of very underplayed drama that obviously had a lot of tension. And looking back, I think it was quite early on in the film. I'd missed the opening scenes, but it was still at an early enough stage for me to have a certain specific kind of interest in, that the film wasn't over. And so I was dressing, and then more and more I became, fascinated by the film, and I ended up having to just sit down and watch it. And I kept looking at my watch and thinking, I'm going to be extremely late. And this was a sort of a sit-down dinner. It wasn't a party, somewhere up in the Hollywood Hills. So I had to make a decision about, do you turn the film? The other thing is I didn't know what the film was. And so I wanted to get to the end of the film to find the title, apart from anything else. And long story short, I did. I stayed and watched till the end of the film and was sort of devastated by it. The ending and the film and the acting and everything about it. Was incredibly late for this dinner party, which was given by a woman who was Ridley Scott's producer. And so I got there, and I thought best to just be honest. And I said, listen, I was actually ready for dinner, but I started watching this film and I got hooked. I'm really sorry I'm late. And the film's called the Browning version. And she said, well, that's an amazing coincidence because we have the remake rights to the Browning version, and Ridley Scott was going to direct it. It's one of his favourite films of all time. But he's now looking for another director. Would you be interested in doing that? And I said, very cautiously, I said, I don't know. This film is a complete work of genius, and there's nothing wrong with it. And she said, well, it's not so much a remake as it's like taking a great play and just doing it again. And we have a great writer, Ronald Haywood, and I said I would think about it. But that's how I got to know the Browning version. I mean, this period of British cinema, and I would widen that to this period of British culture, and certainly I would include theatre, is very, very interesting. And you think of the films of, let's say, Pressburger Powell. And I would say this period is about my favourite period of British film, that were an incredibly fertile period of the war, which is always, of course, for dramatists, is always a very strong period because you have such great stories to tell, and you have a kind of, let's say, an emotional wave behind you because you're all apparently on the same side and so on. But within that rather crude context, there's an immense room for subtlety. And I would say this was the period of subtlety. What happened to bring this period to an end, let's say in cinema, was the Nouvelle Vague and the new British cinema movement. And what happened in theatre, in parallel to this, was, let us say, the kitchen sink dramatists, where you had people like John Osborne and Arnold Wesker coming in, with very interesting new work. But it's a shame when one looks back. I would say that Rattigan was one of the greatest British playwrights of all time. I would say also, in his own way, Noel Coward, when one looks at his work. And I would include Coward because Coward's contribution to British film of quality was also outstanding, and they were contemporaries. Although one can see all of the sort of merits of the new drama and of, say, the Nouvelle Vague-inspired cinema, there was a subtlety about the system that they basically swept away, which would be epitomized by someone like Rattigan. For example, a play like The Deep Blue Sea, and certainly a play like the Browning version, are so modern and so incredibly intellectually subtle, far more subtle, I might say, than the kitchen sink dramatists. And so it's sometimes incredibly cruel what happens when a new movement comes along, in that they do usually throw out the baby with the bathwater. But I have to say, I mean, when you look at, say, the work of Lindsay Anderson, let's take a film like If, which deals with the class system as epitomized by the public school system. And there you have a very violent revolution taking place within the school as a kind of, allegory, where guns are used and people are shot and there's a real war breaks out. And of course, I remember seeing that film and thinking, yes, this is absolutely perfectly in tune with our time, with the music that's happening and with the whole sort of social attitude of change that everybody wanted. I mean, there was a real need for it. And again, not all films, but a lot of new British cinema was a complete breath of fresh air. And perhaps, sadly, one could say that it's only with the passage of time that you then can go back and revisit, say, the work of Rattigan or Noel Coward and see the brilliance that's just sitting in that work. But at the time, it was very difficult for people to spot that. It just seemed to smell of the same bad class system, prejudice, snobbery, ingrained sort of attitude that was only founded on privilege, Terence Rattigan was a very interesting man in an interesting time in our culture. He was gay, and his plays deal with a lot of male relationships and sort of father-son relationships. And he, of course, existed in a time where it wasn't possible to, as we would say these days, to come out and write openly about his gayness, So, again, one sees in his writing a kind of compression and the need to write almost in parallel to his feelings. And so that there is a specific kind of tension in his writing and a specific kind of angst, which I think is unique and, quite magnificent as a piece of drama. And I think Rattigan was someone who, at the end of his life, should really have been at the height of his career and the height of his, the appreciation by audiences and critics, but unfortunately had sort of been replaced by the new model and really was out of favour by the time he died. I think the time that the Browning version came out, the fact that Terence Rattigan was also credited as the screenwriter is an example of what I see as a kind of positive situation at the time where filmmakers didn't think it was necessary to get a film person to write a screenplay. There was perhaps a recognition that there wasn't such a difference between a play and a film. One just happened to be a filmed play in a way. And certainly when you look at the Browning version, you can see, if you choose to, you can see that it is a play. I would say that, in fact, one of the things I really like about the film version is clearly it's a play. Also interesting that the Browning version is a one-act play. It's been described by various critics as perhaps one of the greatest one-act plays ever written. And I always had, my theory was that, if you're going to make a film from a novel or from a piece of writing, not a play, that a short story is possibly your best source, that really films, even 90-minute films, are short stories. And if you try and cram a novel into a 90-minute film, you're going to have to deal with editing in a sort of very severe way, and the audience will finally smell the reductive process. And I think one of the things that makes the Browning version such a success is that it was a one-act play, that already the compression had gone into the writing of the play, so the adapting of it for the screen meant that you could sort of fill it out, obviously, with some exterior scenes and so on, but the actual psychological drama was already there in the play. When one talks about this quality period of British film, I think as much as anything it's because when you look at, for example, the cast and crew lists of these films, they were intensely clever people who were very familiar with the craft of theatre and of drama, let's say, rather than just theatre. And there was a recognition that these things were closely related. Probably the situation was, in those days it was probably quite hard sometimes to persuade dramatists of quality to come to the cinema rather than the other way around, But a film like the Browning version would be the kind of ultimate example of where if you both skills and both worlds can come together in such a strong way. I think for me, and I assume for Rattigan, because he wrote it, the fascinating element of the character of Crocker Harris was that he was an incredibly passionate man who was a Stoic. This man is the epitome of the Stoic, which means that is a person who's not going to show his feelings and who has immense pride and inner strength, and through a bad marriage and through a combination of these personality characteristics, has somehow fallen out of time with himself. He's no longer someone that people can relate to. He's at a certain age. This man is the product of the British public school system, whereby the teaching of classics, of Greek myths, and one of the central stories of Agamemnon in the Browning version, within those stories, certain modifications had been made for very specific reasons of colonialism. The British school system, public school system, was producing individual young men to go out into Africa or the colonies, wherever, and to be able to administrate the colonies, but without the backup of a wife or a mother or women. And so Stoicism was very, very important. The ability to, the cliche being the stiff upper lip of the British school boy. And so they basically took out all of the sexual romanticism from these stories, and they focused on what was useful for them, which was the Stoicism. These repressed characteristics, or these hidden characteristics, are something which, of course, the audience can see. And the genius of the writing here is that we, the audience, are let in on this secret early on. We like this man. We like him because he's so well written, and we like him because he's so beautifully played in the original by Redgrave. And so we know that he's misunderstood. And that's a really interesting ability in a great writer and a great director and a great actor to immediately, and remember this was a one-act play, so within 5 or 10 minutes we've got to know that this is the good person. This is the person who we sympathize with, and everybody else is coming in a misunderstanding. I mean, you can do that in a crude way, in which case, the drama's not going to work on anything like the same level. But if you do it in this brilliant piece of writing in such a subtle way, then all of our aspirations for the drama are that please somebody come along to understand him. So finally, when the great breakthrough scene occurs, this most brilliant, heartbreaking scene where the boy actually gives him a gift, and at first he even misunderstands that it is a gift. He's almost prepared to sort of sabotage it, and one can see Rattigan going right to the edge here of going, please, open up and let this appreciation in. But it's carried right to the precipice of Stoicism. I mean, it's painful to watch. And I remember so clearly the first time I saw the film going, for God's sake, break through. And then finally, of course, when he does, it's devastating. But it has to be devastating by that point because we've gone so far with the withholding of this piece of information that when it does come through, it really is a revelation. And the film turns on that incident and goes from one kind of a film to another kind of film without ever, and again this is why we're talking about quality British cinema here, without ever lapsing into that sort of crass sentimentality that often cinema lurches towards at a moment like this. Let's milk this for all it's worth. It remains stoic, and in fact he continues to put the knife in after the event, and it's even more painful now because all the nerve endings are exposed. So it is actually an immensely cruel piece of drama. Cruel in order to be kind, in order to get finally to a point of revelation or of understanding about human nature. By the end of this film, one has had to go on a very tough journey with the character. It's quite devastating to watch. my memory of this film, of Redgrave's performance, was so strong. Everybody was good, but his performance was so riveting that it just really lodged in me, in my memory. I watched it one more time because I hadn't seen the beginning, and I wanted to see it as a complete event, not an interrupted event. And that was enough for me. And then by then I was also seriously thinking about doing how I was going to do my version of the film. And I really didn't want to be trapped in that thing of knowing a masterful performance in its technical details. Because I was also going to be working with an actor that I consider to be really a genius, Albert Finney. And he certainly didn't want to be compared. I mean, his respect for Redgrave was absolutely 100%. But, we were both setting out to try and do something as in a play. So if you're doing Hamlet, you really don't want to just watch Olivier and then note every little nuance and go, let's just copy all of that. Or have to have that in one's mind as being something to avoid. I would say the brilliance of the writing coupled with the brilliance of Redgrave's performance transcended style issues. I remember talking to Albert Finney about this. He said he referred to what he called a style of British acting called dandruff acting. And I said, oh, Albert, what is dandruff acting? He said, when the actor, whenever they're going to say something, they always kind of go, well, really, darling, I think we should be going to, or cufflink acting, where you go, I really think we should get ready for dinner now, darling, because, So people were always doing these very small mannerisms, and they were forever dusting things. And it was either dandruff or invisible dust, but there were these very precise movements of the hands which were constantly sort of, and this was the kind of movement. And it comes from a theatrical tradition, of course, where hand movements have to be slightly larger than they would be in cinema. I think that what I love about the original is that the context is this very stylized British, sort of very British acting, with little elements of dandruff acting thrown in. And the central character is everything. Everything revolves and comes to the Redgrave performance. When I did the film, I tried to open that up a little bit because the styles of acting have changed. And I found it interesting to take a great text and to see if it had, the potential to expand a little bit in terms of the style of acting. So when for example, the headmaster played by Michael Gambon and Julian Sands and Greta Skarki and so on. So I gave all those characters more air, more space to breathe as individual characters. But I would also have to say that what I love about the original version is the compression of those characters, the fact that they're almost trapped in a style of acting which also works superbly for that text. And I could imagine, for example, directing it as a play now and almost wanting to return to that style of acting as a mannerism, almost as a kind of, in the way that sort of, when you do, for example, Japanese theatre, there's a certain style of movement. And one could say at a certain period of British drama there was a style of movement which is not naturalistic and yet is compelling to watch because it's very minimal, it's very economic in terms of its movement. It's not expansive and loud in the way that American acting of that period was. There's a sort of dignity and a restraint about it which makes it almost a drama of manners. And this is a drama of manners. It's about the class system and about the system within the public schools and so on. This is something that is absolutely compressed with drama and with tragedy. It's what makes it a truly, truly great, one of the truly great films.